I'm Saeed Chaudhry from Carnegie Mellon. Those are my roles at Carnegie Mellon. Like some of you, I have left Twitter and I am on Blue Sky. So if you want to engage on social media, please go to Blue Sky instead of Twitter, at least in my case. I'm here to talk about the Open Forum for Artificial Intelligence, or OFAI, as we call it, at CMU. This was launched this past July 2024, and it's received funding from Carnegie Mellon University libraries from our reserve funds, and also two organizations called the Omidyar Network and the NobleReach Foundation. You may not be familiar with those groups. They were started by people from the private equity, venture finance, and tech world, but they have nonprofit wings through which we are getting our funding. The CEO of NobleReach Foundation is Arun Gupta. He's written a book called Venture Meets Mission, and the idea is how does the venture Silicon Valley way of doing things meet the public sector? So he likes to use the term mission capital, and that's what they've provided for OFAI. So the overarching goal for OFAI is to bend the arc towards human-centered AI. And by human-centered, what OFAI means is that the people who use and are affected by AI should be the ones who evaluate, test, and affirm the safety, the transparency, the lack of bias, and so on, rather than the builders or deployers of AI systems, right? So right now we have large companies deploying these models on some frequent basis. We all react to those and go look at them and study them. It's largely difficult to understand the impact from a transparency or reproducibility or safety perspective. We're relying on them to self-report. OFAI, in some sense, is trying to invert that so that it's a more proactive approach, that we can say these are the desirable attributes of an AI system, and please build and design and deploy your models accordingly. If you think about the development of the internet and the web, there was a triad or a triple helix of industry, government, and university. And if you think of the shift from the internet to the web to AI, the role of the private sector has grown considerably in that triple helix. And I'm not saying that in a values type of way. I'm just noting that that imbalance, I think, has some consequences, some of them unintended, but we need to address that and try and rebalance that partnership or triad. And the way that we're trying to do that through OFAI is to raise the voice of the universities as a sector. So while this is a CMU-led initiative, we have currently 3 other universities involved, Georgia Tech, George Washington University, and the University of Texas at Austin. And all of those organizations are involved through their open source programs offices. Carnegie Mellon has a more broad type of involvement through the OSPO, but also through things like our Responsible AI program. But we have these universities coming together to work on OFAI issues. And we are looking for additional partners, of course. Now, in addition to the university voice, we recognize there's other types of capacity or expertise that is very important to tap into. So a couple of examples include the Open Source Initiative. So I'm a board member at OSI. This is the group that is the official steward of the definition and licenses around open source software. And we have gone through a process to define open source AI, which I'll talk about in a few slides. The Atlantic Council is a think tank or a policy group in Washington, D.C., and the Creative Commons, I think many of you know, from the sort of open data world. Conscience is not a group, is a group you may not have heard of. It's a nonprofit that is using AI for drug discovery where there are market failures. So when the pharmaceutical industry says there's no profit here, there's no incentive here, Conscience has done some really amazing work in drug discovery in that area. And both Creative Commons and Conscience are providing a lot of capacity around public data. We're engaging the private and public sector as well, but not as partners. So we have individuals from the following organizations that are involved in OFAI. And in the case of the Navy, it's the Chief Technology Officer. So this is very intentional in that we recognize it's, of course, valuable to get the perspective of the private and public sector, but we don't want people to feel like they're having the same level of influence, quite frankly, within our network. So they're not even considered an advisory board. They're more like sounding boards or connectors. We are trying to form an OFAI advisory board as well. I'm glad to note that somebody from the Mozilla Foundation has agreed. Somebody from the Atlantic Council has agreed. And we have a colleague at CMU, Ann Lambright, who's doing a lot of great work with my colleague Nikki Agate, who's in the crowd, on humanities perspectives on AI. So we're getting additional feedback in addition to the partners themselves. This is a snapshot of the current leadership. So I am the director of it. We have a lot of people from CMU. Hoda Adari is the co-lead for the Responsible AI program at Carnegie Mellon, and she leads the research working group. Vince Shaw, who you'll see in a video clip shortly, is an assistant dean in our College of Humanities and Social Sciences and leads the technical prototypes group. Deb Bryant is a longtime, well-respected leader in the open source community who is leading our community engagement efforts. Trey Herr is at the Atlantic Council. He's one of our advisors, and he's helping us with the policy recommendations effort. And Rachel Zombach is another colleague of mine at Carnegie Mellon who's leading what's called the Talent for Service track. And that is basically how do you identify people who have the right skill sets and could be oriented towards a more systems view, a holistic view AI, and prepare them through training and curricular development for roles in the public sector. So we see all of these groups having distinct goals and scope, but there's a strong interrelationship between them. And I'll talk about that a little bit with something called our landscape map. So the open in OFAI has a few particular connotations, if you will. One of them is that the value of openness is a design principle. So I talked about the internet and the web. If you think about TCP/IP or HTTP as protocols, these were open protocols. They were global protocols. In many ways, what they did is remove all the local variants. If you remember, IBM had something called Token Ring, which is a way they were exchanging information over the internet. When TCP/IP came out, it made no sense to run a local variant, right? So having these global open protocols and approach is really important for fostering innovation and participation and so on. There are now well-documented benefits from this kind of openness in the open source software community. The Harvard Business School has conducted a study that indicated that open source software has generated $8.8 trillion of value, and it's reduced the production costs by a factor of 3.5. So that's very significant, of course. Another way of being open is questioning and testing assumptions. So I'm not immune from, I'll just say, the anxieties around what AI might be doing to our society, might be doing to us, might be doing in the future on its own. But I think it's understandable that as we try to grapple what that might mean, we start to make assumptions or assertions about how it works. But I think it's really important to focus on the evidence and the research and ground whatever types of decisions and strategies and policies we have on that evidence and on that research. And then finally, given the speed and really, quite frankly, the potential impact of AI, to be as open as possible with producing our outputs. I know we can talk about lots of reasons for open access and so on, but I'm going back to what I think is one of the core principles, is just get the information and then knowledge out as soon as possible, as openly as possible. And that's not to say there aren't other ways you can do that, but we're really asking all of our researchers to focus on preprints, and we're looking at creating policy briefs, and we're going to produce things like the landscape map, which I'll show you in just a second. So at the heart of our work is developing something called the Openness in AI framework. I obviously can't say OpenAI for really annoying reasons. So Openness in AI framework is a technical framework, but it's not intended to be only for engineers or AI developers or deployers. But again, grounding in that technical dimension of AI, but developed with community engagement, and it rigorously explores and defines what it means to be open in AI, not as defined by a company, and what is the ensuing or corresponding value. So openness is actually not the end goal. Openness is a means towards safety, transparency, lack of bias, and so on. And a way that we will hopefully accomplish that is moving from this sense of open source, which is more about the objects, sort of the components, to open governance, which is more about how those things are designed, deployed, and shared. How do we actually assess the openness of an AI system and think about making it more accessible and so on. And the research group in particular has made a very important point that openness needs to be considered in a specific context and for specific use cases. Again, it's not enough to say this system is open. I'm not trying to pick on something like the Hugging Face leaderboards that are looking at openness in AI models. It's very helpful. But what questions can I ask of those models when I look at something like that? It's not enough, in my opinion, to just have a ranking of those models, but to actually understand the who, the why, the what, the who, and the when, and the where. So one foundational piece of this openness in AI framework is the open source AI definition. I mentioned that I'm a board member at the Open Source Initiative, and that OSI has led at least 2-year-long effort in an inclusive community co-design process to come up with this definition of open source AI. And in many ways, what it's trying to do is affirm the so-called 4 freedoms of open source software. So one of the benefits that led to that $8.8 trillion value is that if something is truly open source software, you can use, study, modify, and share the software. We're trying to bring those same 4 freedoms to open source AI so that I ought to be able to do the same things with an AI system. Now, it's really important to remember, though, that AI is fundamentally different and more complex than software. So in many ways, what the open source AI definition has done is introduce the legal and software developer-oriented perspectives on what it means to have open source AI. And now what I see OFAI and others doing is bringing the engineering dimensions into that conversation. And one of the ways we do that is to obviously look at the definition itself. This is a screenshot from the definition. I encourage you to go take a look at it yourself. And probably, just in full disclosure, the most contentious part of this was the requirements around data. So the definition did not require that you share all the data used to train an AI model. And that's not because we wouldn't like that to happen, but that's because there are legal reasons you may not be able to share this. There are privacy reasons. Think of medical data that you may not be able to share the data. There are practicality reasons. Some of the digital twins generate petabytes of data. Are you going to send that to me over the web? I don't think so. So we weren't saying that it's not important to have the data. It's just that in order to have a definition that can actually be actionable and pragmatic and usable, you can provide detailed information in cases where you can't share the data. I will say that I posted on LinkedIn a new model. I don't know how to pronounce it. I think it's Playos, that actually does provide the data that they use for training. The Allen Institute in Washington has ALMA, which is another model that does the same thing. So there are examples of those. Those would be consistent with the open source AI definition. And then there are provisions around the code and the weights. Those are required to be shared. So the training code and the weights that you use to tune and configure a model. This is a screenshot from the Mozilla Foundation's endorsement of the open source AI definition. It's a very strong endorsement, and I've highlighted one line in particular. You can read that yourself, that it's marking a critical juncture in the evolution of the internet. I'm not the right person to comment on whether that's a fair statement or not, but I definitely respect the Mozilla Foundation, and if that's how they feel, then more power to them. But I definitely think the last line is really on the mark. It's about shaping the future of this technology and its impact on society. And we have a real opportunity to do this in a community-oriented way, in an open way, however much challenges we may face. We think that the open source AI definition puts the proverbial stake in the ground. If you think about the fact that the EU AI Act mentions open source AI and has less stringent types of requirements from a regulatory basis, but does not define it. There are federal documents and memos that talk about open source AI. In the Office of Management Budget talked about procuring open source AI, doesn't define it. So we have clear signals that there is value to using open source AI, but not a definition. So we hope that our definition from the community process can provide that benchmark. So what we like to say is that releasing version 1.0 in October, which we did at the All Things Open meeting, provided a stable reference point, but not a permanent one. We do understand that it'll have to evolve over time. Not everybody is a fan of this definition. In particular, Meta. This is an article from The Economist. You can certainly go take a look at it for yourself. I don't know why the writer used the metaphor of Zuckerberg and a Mankini, but if you get past that, you can see that Meta has basically asserted its own definition of open source AI. It maps completely to their Llama models. I've noticed advertisements now about open source AI from Meta. So they have a marketing campaign that is now also being part of this effort to define open source AI. I will note that other big tech companies we've talked to have had a more nuanced approach, going so far as saying, we may not even agree with the definition, but we respect the process you used to come to the definition. We would like to engage in how this definition might evolve. So whatever you may think of the definition, I think one big question is, do you want any single company, not just Meta, any company defining what open source AI is for everybody, or do you want an inclusive community process for that to happen? And I think you know what my answer to that is. So one thing I want to bring up and show you is what we're calling the OFAI landscape map. And this is a way of basically showing what's happening within the OFAI in a programmatic way. So a visual, concise way of saying, here are the types of activities, projects, organizations, programs, working groups of OFAI, so that people can either find out what's happening or can say, we can contribute, we can identify new partners that way, or in essence, we can compare OFAI in alignment to other efforts like partnerships in AI or the AI Alliance and so on. That's a question I get often is, how is this different from those other efforts? So rather than me sending lots of emails or commenting on Blue Sky or whatever, you can come to this map and take a look at it. And the way that the map is organized is along one dimension are what our beliefs are about the current components of an AI model or system, and then the post-deployment types of activities like evaluation, oversight, and so on. And then the other dimension are the working groups, research, technical prototypes, community engagement, policy recommendations, and talent for service. So now we get into the dangerous. I'm going to get on Wi-Fi and see if this works. So this is the OFAI landscape map. The vision is the map that the Cloud Native Computing Federation has created. We're using the same software, so another benefit for open source software. You can see that in essence, this is a map of all sorts of projects organized along different dimensions, and that's where we're aiming to go, right? So now you can see there are activities and there are projects from each of the partners. They've been put onto the map according to those two dimensions. The card view is another way of looking at this, maybe even a more accessible way. So you have two ways of sifting through the information in any given case. I will not pick Carnegie Mellon to be as objective as possible. This is a project that's taking place at George Washington University called Trails. You can click on the particular link, see a brief description, and then you can, of course, go to the website itself for additional information. So I'll just wait. And the idea being, you can come at any time and see this map and see what we're doing. Hopefully other organizations will engage with us and come along and you can see what they're doing. And I guess what I'll say is, regardless of what happens January 20th at 12:01, I would like to believe that having a map of what's happening in the AI ecosystem will be helpful to anyone for whatever policy conversations might be happening or partnerships that might happen and so on. So, I will keep reminding people of this map, but I encourage you to check it out yourself, of course. So the next thing I want to show you is a video presentation from Vince Shaw. I mentioned he's the head of the technical prototypes group. He has done some amazing work that we'll show you in this clip, and then I'll make a couple of comments afterwards.
Hello, I'm Vincent Shaw, Associate Dean for IT and Operations for Dietrich College of Humanities and Social Sciences and Technical Lead for the Open Forum for AI here at Carnegie Mellon University. Today I'll be sharing with you a little bit about our AI adoption strategy and one of our LLM-powered prototypes. Our journey kind of started in April 2023, where I co-led a committee commissioned by our Dean Richard Shyness with faculty across our college to examine the disruption of what ChatGPT meant for us as a higher education institution and all these new LLM tools. We met weekly performing a SWOT analysis, strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats, for those of you not familiar with the technical term, about how we should be what this means for each discipline and how we should be responding to it. At the end of that, we publish a best practices guide for our faculty for teaching and policies, but we also formulated a strategy of adoption and innovation, which kind of led to this collaboration with Saeed and I here in the founding of the Open Forum for AI. Our primary focus for our technical prototypes is reducing technical logistical barriers to access. We feel that as people gain a deeper appreciation for these tools, instructors and students will better be able to scaffold the uses of these tools to use them more responsibly and more productively in research and education, also in their professional lives as they graduate. The result of our work has been the creation of this platform that we call DARE, Dietrich Analysis Research Education Suite, which is a productivity suite, set of tools that has things like basic chat, document summarization, retrieval augmented generation capabilities, all in a campus controlled environment. It's a sandbox designed to allow users to create and store custom system prompts, gives them access to all the different major large language models through the API. There's cost controls and budgets, and they can leverage data from any source. And more importantly, they can also conduct research in the platform. And what we hope is that as we have greater adoption, our faculty will come up with their own great ideas on these types of tools we can create. And one of the great ideas that came out of the collaboration in the committee that I led was Socratic Books, which was proposed by my colleague, Danny Oppenheimer, who is a psychologist in the Social Decision Sciences Department in psychology. What Socratic Books is I like to consider our entry in the pantheon of trying to solve Bloom's two sigma problem. Benjamin Bloom published a paper in 1984 which showed that one-on-one mentoring and tutoring was superior than any other teaching intervention because it can meet, when you get, we all know who have had great mentors, is that when somebody can adapt to you, meet you where you are, you learn faster, you learn better. And textbooks often they don't do that. They're just one size fits all. They could be designed for many different locations. You might be from a location that you don't understand analogies or things like that. So we created Socratic Books. So let's go ahead and hop right into that. So first, I want to give a quick layout of how Socratic Book is set up and why an instructor might want to use it. What it does is it gives you the ability to really extend your pedagogy into what you feel is important about teaching lessons and concepts. So one of the first things an instructor will do is go ahead and they'll upload their own files or papers or research papers or could be chapters of things, and to ground the knowledge. So Socratic Books is essentially a multi-agent RAG tool, right? On the left here, so you can see the files are here. You can assign chapters of books, students can join them, and you can have a choice between using GPT or Claude. You set the context of lesson here. You can set the learning goals. You can get as nuanced and granular as you want. This particular one is about GPT's mixture of expert frameworks and the tree of thought system prompting. It was created as a prototype, one of our colleagues who teaches about large language models in high school. Below the learning goals, the next three windows concatenate into one large prompt about how you want the teaching to occur and how you want the Socratic tutor to interact with the student, whether that's, how you can engage in question and answer, how you're going to guide them along in the lesson, some restrictions and formatting. And the bottom is a second bot that works in tandem with the first one and it helps to track how the student's progress is going, helps track mastery if the student wants to take mastery tests. And those are all voluntary because we want to encourage learning environment, not necessarily assessment here. We have plans for a different assessment tool, but that's a different project. So let's jump right into the tool. And we'll go through this really quickly. On the left side, you see where the tracking happens, that the learning goals and the progress tracking will happen. The center is the main window where your interaction happens. On the right is where a student can take notes and you can save them to your account. They can log back in, they can look at their old notes. We'll be also creating buttons and prompts so they can create their own study guides from them, audio files for download, similar to what you've seen if you're familiar with Google Notebook LLM. Unfortunately, we had the plan earlier, but we couldn't release in time. If anyone has a few $1 billion laying around, we'd be happy to have it and we'll get that released short quickly. So let's have a quick interaction so we can see how it works. We just say hello and the system immediately comes online and we'll start kind of telling us what the lesson is, and let's just jump right in. Let's do LG1. And as you can see, before I hit that, the progress tracker immediately starts to track and it looks at the conversation after each iteration to see what's been done, what's been updated, how the student's progressing, and it tells you what you need to be doing. So let's do LG1. And immediately it's going to go ahead and start teaching a lesson about kind of the mixture of experts framework, and which is a quite technical framework for people who maybe don't have a deep background in this type of work. I happen to like Iron Man, so I'm going to ask it if it can relate that to Iron Man. Can you relate this information? Let's see how the system pivots. So immediately what you see is the system meeting me for where I'm at as a learner, right? I'm asking it to, I grew up, I love comic books and Tony Stark, and immediately kind of pivots the lesson around something I can ground myself in, and it wraps a lesson around that, which is, we think will really enhance when people are attached to things that make them more excited, when people are attached to information in their brains that are salient, that really helps with the learning process and make the cover. And it has the ability to do that in whatever kind of pop culture or anything is within the training data, right? And fortunately, because of the pretty good representation in different languages, it actually pivot to most of the major languages that are represented in large language models. And since we're short on time for this demo, I just want to move through really quickly and also show you how the mastery works. You give mastery test this learning goal. And the way that that works is the agent knows that it should only be taking in my input. So, I can't it doesn't read that the fact that the answer has already been set in the context. What it does is it go ahead and it looks through the conversation to see of my responses, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and answer one of them. Let's see here. MQ1, Jarvis works as gate. And you can see, go ahead and it will go ahead and it's going to give me credit here in a moment here on the left for mastery. But what I really like seeing is that, it was just a short answer. It wasn't nuanced enough, right? So it gave me partial credit because right now in this version, we have 5 questions as mastery. Instructor can set that to as many as they would like. And it really kind of pushes me to have a deeper understanding of that, right? And let's go ahead and actually just look at another question here and answer it incorrectly. Ask, I need help with this one. And it will go ahead and just kind of meet me where I'm at. And basically what will happen is as you work through one lesson, the system will kind of keep monitoring. As you get towards the end of a lesson, it will go ahead and nudge you to the next one. I don't want to spend too much time here teaching everybody about these 2 concepts, but I hope that you found this demonstration interesting, and that have a wonderful day.
So just a couple of points about these technical prototypes. So you could see Vince is using right now Claude or ChatGPT-4. He's also testing it with some of the models which I would consider open source AI. And he's saying once the performance gets to that level, he'll shift over. All the work that he is doing, all the work that any technical prototype that will come out of OFAI will be open source AI. So we're committed to making that decision. And I will note that one of the fellows for OFAI works at something called PGV Capital, a venture finance group. And I'm in active conversation with him. He's a managing partner about funding the open source AI prototypes that come out of OFAI and more generally. And they're very much interested in supporting responsible human-centered AI. So it's important to try and get flows of money, just to be blunt, into this kind of open source AI and this type of approach. So I am 1 minute from the end, so I hope we can have at least 1 or 2 questions or discussion. These are some resources. I placed them in the SCED or SHED, if you're from the UK, website, and so you can have them there, but I'm sure the slides will be available at some point. So I just want to acknowledge our funders again and open it up for any kinds of comments, questions, feedback you might have. Thank you.
Interesting project. How do you think about sustaining this long term? I mean, there's obviously big money to build any of these models, but they take a lot to run as well.
They do. You're right. So there's a couple of things on the sustainability dimension. One is to align it with work that's already happening and try to nudge that work toward the goals and the values and the approach we're taking for OFAI. So we've identified technical prototypes at UT Austin. That work is happening independent of whether we fund it or not. There's also the sustainability of OFAI as a concept, right? We have funding through July of 2025 from the initial funders. But I've heard from our current funders and other funders and from Carnegie Mellon itself that this is something we wish to sustain. As long as we can keep producing outputs, whether those are, we have a position paper that I wish had been done by today, but it isn't. But as soon as it is, I'm happy to share it with everybody, the map, the prototypes, and so on, that there's value in doing this work. And quite frankly, there's urgency in doing this work. And if people are interested and engaged in that, whether that's through financial support or in-kind contributions or work that you're already doing, we certainly welcome that.
Just building off that question, what do you see as some of our options for long-term sustainability in the sense of treating it like a utility or those sorts of things? How are you thinking about, as we're bringing these different groups together, what do we start to seed in people's minds about how we think about the real long-term preservation and sustainability? And I'm Casey Wright at the Association of Public and Land-Grant Universities.
Right. So this is just my own opinion. Okay. I think the large AI foundational model deployers have gotten themselves into a bind. I think they received enormous amounts of money. They're not getting the return on investment that they thought they would get. But what they have essentially done is built infrastructure for the rest of us to build on top of. I have serious concerns about infrastructure being opaque. So that, just to be very clear about that. But all the work that Vince has done and many, many other people are doing are building on that infrastructure. And if you have an open source AI system and something goes wrong, and you can evaluate it rigorously because it's open, then there must be something at that infrastructure layer that's causing the issues. And I think that's the way we open up those kinds of infrastructure layers. I don't think they wanted to create infrastructure for all of us to build a whole set of new models. They sort of said, look, we're very supportive and inclusive and participatory. You can do whatever you want. People have gone to town on that. So I think we just need to keep building where we can in open ways and in essence basically connect to their infrastructure and say, you need to open this up if somebody says this is not safe, or this is having a reproducibility issue or so on. So that's a technical type of response to that. In terms of the preservation of AI systems, I don't have an answer for that. These things are so dynamic, they're so statistical, they're so complex. You start with a set of training data, you iterate that data over each of the training runs and so on and so on. These are very complex issues that I think we need to address, but I don't think we have a good handle on them right now. So it is 9:18, let's call it. Thank you for your attention.